The session recordings for HoldCoConf 2022 are brought to you by Axial. Axial is a lower middle market deal sourcing platform. To learn more and to start accessing new deal flow today, head to axial.net.
All right, Warren Buffett, pay attention. We're going to build a baby Berkshire. Kevin Henderson. Real quick, those of you that know, S&B Law Group just formed, and we were hoping to have both Sam and Eric here. If any of you know them personally, they've got some crazy stuff in their personal lives. They couldn't make it. Thankfully, Kevin could be here. He's the third part of that firm. And again, we're all kind of mini Warren Buffetts in our own mind. And so get ready to build a Berkshire.
Thanks, Kelsey. That's right. You're not only not getting the B team, you're getting the C team. So apologies in advance. But here we are. It's interesting building a baby Berkshire. Why is a lawyer standing in front of you to talk about Warren Buffett? I'm the furthest thing from Warren Buffett. But as you all may or may not know, Warren Buffett's right-hand man is, anybody? Charlie, right? Our buddy Charlie. So, let us be the Charlie Munger to your Warren Buffett. That's what we're here for. I thought this was a great quote as well. It's remarkable how much long-term advantage people like us have gotten by trying to be consistently not stupid instead of trying to be very intelligent. I think that's a lot of what we do. That's a lot of HoldCo design. That's a lot of running a business, as you all know. But brief intro, we'll get it out of the way. Look, I'm a lawyer. I can't not do it, right? Nothing in here is legal advice. You all have your own thing going on. My goal today is for you guys to leave not, with what should I go do, but maybe armed with a little bit of what can I go do, and then, work with your own advisors, doing your, research, whatever it takes, to come up with a strategy that works for your business, that works for your personality. We heard this morning. I'm missing the names, but talking about how they tried the shared services model. They think there's a lot of economic value they may get there, but it just didn't work in the business, and so they don't really pursue a shared services model. Everyone's unique, personality-wise, business-wise, structure-wise. So we'll talk through some structuring considerations, what sort of options there are, things like that. But this is all informational. Don't necessarily go and rely and stake your structure on this. It's a great time to pause for the disclaimer. The bar's open. If you thought you were coming here 45 minutes later to walk out knowing exactly how to structure your HoldCo with QSBS and the tax elections, and you're going to go, I'll do it tomorrow, probably going to be disappointed. So grab a drink. You can catch Eric's Twitter thread where he already posted everything I'm about to say. Who we are really quickly, why should you care what I'm talking about? We're a small transactional law firm. We're focused on this market, small and medium businesses. We just launched, Sam and Eric, my partners, Sam Rosati, Eric, many of you may know as S&B attorney on Twitter. I spent my career at large Wall Street law firms, spent about a decade doing, kind of the headline type deals. And then I went on in-house for 3 years with a large public company where one of my primary responsibilities was managing the corporate governance portfolio. During my 3-year period, we were rationalizing. We dropped from about 180 entities to 125 entities worldwide. These structures can get large and very complex. You can read bios on our website, whatever. Eric, similar background. Sam, many of you know, he tried to keep secret for many years that he was a lawyer. The cat's out of the bag, but he's much more at home buying and running businesses. So that's briefly about us. So let's launch in. This will be the shortest portion. What is a holding company? Not to talk down to you too much, but just to level set. A holding company is a company set up for the specific purpose of only holding equity interests in downstream companies. So it has no operations. right? You're not generally employing people out of a HoldCo. You're not generally manufacturing anything. You're not providing services. You're literally just owning other stuff. It's an important distinction for a lot of reasons. It can impact a lot of things, tax treatment, how you can govern the entity, et cetera. So we'll dig a little bit into that. But it's important to keep in mind that top level HoldCo really is just a shell. And what you're doing is creating a structure for everything else you're going to do down underneath that HoldCo. And that's where the fun really comes. So who uses holding companies? Everyone, right? I mean, the holding companies are so common from any public company that you know. Those public companies don't do anything, right? Apple Inc. does nothing except raise securities in the equity markets and then push it down to downstream entities. Alphabet, you can see their whole structure. Alphabet Inc. sits up top. It doesn't do anything except report to the SEC and do financing activities. On the right, this is Berkshire Hathaway, snapshot of a lot of their portfolio companies. So you've got their top level quasi-public company, if anyone can afford a share, and everything else is done underneath. So very common for a lot of reasons, and we'll dig into the advantages here in a second. So how do we actually structure these? So let's dig into the meat, and feel free to interrupt, ask questions, rather talk with you than at you. But there are a lot of different options. And when you dig in, a lot of them are hybrid. A lot of people pursue one particular model. Like I said at the start, no one is necessarily better than the other. They're just different, and they accomplish different things. So what are some of your options? Some companies have a geographic-oriented structure. This is a little bit more common, not necessarily in our space, but in multinationals. It becomes really important in multinationals where a lot of things have to be done independently in certain jurisdictions. But that doesn't mean it can't be done within the US as well. And there may be reasons that you want to do things geographically even within the US, have an entity by state or by region or things like that. So you've got a snapshot of a piece of Coca-Cola's entity structure there, PepsiCo to compare. So in these portions of their business, you'll see PepsiCo uses kind of a hybrid geographic and segment structure. So you've got PepsiCo International with EMA in Europe. You've got PepsiCo Americas Beverages. So there's a regional drop down that's both regional to the Americas, but it's also beverages, right? Then you've got PepsiCo America Foods with Frito-Lay North America. There's going to be Frito-Lay entities in other jurisdictions. So the other option is the segment structure. So if we back up here, you'll notice in this hodgepodge of Berkshire Hathaway, right down towards the bottom left, you'll see one of their many portfolio companies is Berkshire Hathaway Energy. So if you skip forward, and you see this a lot in these structures, that portfolio company is once again a HoldCo, right? It's a segment HoldCo underneath a parent HoldCo. So you've got Berkshire Hathaway Inc. up top. It owns 90% of Berkshire Hathaway Energy. There's some outside investment money there. And then that further drops down by different segments. So if you look at these are generally not regional. These are generally segregated by types of business, by business segment. A lot of this is driven for regulatory reasons. And so this is a great example of why one structure may be better than another for different people, right? If you're involved in energy like Berkshire Hathaway Energy is, you sort of have to be segmented for regulatory reasons on a business segment basis, right? You have to have electric utilities different from other utilities in different jurisdictions. This would be an example of a segment structure where most of their complexity comes based on the drop-down businesses. This is probably a little closer to what we think about in this space, right? As you're going through acquisitions, you may have a landscaping business, and then you may acquire, like we heard earlier from Chenmark, a snow removal business, right? That may drop into a different segment. So this is commonly where we see a structure like this go. So those are some big company examples. Well, let's pause on this one and dig in here a little bit more. This is kind of a top level example of what a small or medium business focused holdco structure, like many of you may look at, may be structured. So let's talk these through. At the top level, you've got your holdco. Your holdco, like I said, isn't going to do anything. It's just going to own everything else. How you form that holdco, though, may be informed by a lot of different factors, and we'll get to those in just a minute. But it'll be some form of entity. For here, I mean, this is just a straw man. So you can see the key over to the right. In a typical structure chart, you're going to identify usually the tax status and the entity form throughout your structure, because it's really easy to lose track of as you start to add layers of complexity throughout your organization. So the circles you can see under entity form, that's a partnership or LLC. So you can easily see from the circles where your pass-through entities are. Squares are generally going to be corporations. So this would be an example LLC structure where you have your holdco. And for this example, doesn't necessarily have to be done this way, and there may be strategic reasons why you want to or don't want to. In this case, we drop down an op holdco, an operations holding company. So here we have a sub-holding company under your parent entity that's then in turn going to own your operating entities. There are different reasons why you may want to do that. You could just as easily take your operating companies and have them owned directly by the holding company, but there could be financing reasons why you don't do that, and we'll get to that in a second. You may be looking ahead over here to the right. Underneath your operating holding company, what are you going to have? You're going to have operating entities, all right? So now we're out of holdco territory. Now we're in operating company territory. And pick your poison. Here I have these in this straw man organized in different states. You're rolling up HVAC companies. You may have an entity for Utah, Texas, Florida, California, Washington. You may have different tax status for the various entities for different reasons. Maybe one of those entities, you decided to do an equity deal. I know that's the worst possible thing anyone could ever recommend you do, but it could happen. You want to do an equity deal. It's a corporation. It comes under your umbrella as a corporation. So not everything has to be the same in your structure. Again, we'll get to the advantages and disadvantages of how to set your structure up in a second. But a lot of those other factors outside of simply the legal structure of your holding company empire, for lack of a better word, will inform those decisions. So you've got your operating companies out there under one holding company. So what else do you have? Right underneath the holding company, you'll see a shared services company. So this might be where you drop a lot of your executive team that may split time, or back office team that may split time across those operating entities. So imagine, for example, your finance function. You've got a CFO and controllers that are running the organization that provide services to all of your operating entities. How do you allocate that employee? Well, those employees may be employed by your shared services company, and those employees are then in turn leased down to the operating entities, and those operating entities have an expense back up to your shared services company for the allocated share of those employees. And I believe there was a previous breakout session or will be a breakout session that'll talk a little bit more about shared services. that's an option. Not everyone does it. Like I mentioned earlier this morning, we heard a great example of where there may be some opportunity to optimize, to use a shared services model, but it just wasn't making sense in their business, and so they didn't go down this route. And each operating company, operates or acted as its own company. It had its own HR function. It had its own management function. So whether you drop those employees into a separate company to allocate across your organization, or have them down in your operating companies is a strategic decision. Could be a financial decision, could be a tax decision. Anybody looking or investing in the cannabis space, for example? Nobody's interested in this space. Well, then this doesn't matter for you, but as a great example, you may be aware in the cannabis space, there's a tax provision, 280E, that doesn't let you deduct normal expenses that a typical business would be able to, like employment expenses, right? So this is very, very common in that space, where all their employees are actually employed by an outside company and leased to the entities, so that outside company can take advantage of the deductions that the operating company that's plant touching, as they say in the industry, can't take advantage of. So lots of different reasons that may either force you or implicate one reason or another why that may be a good way to go. Secondly, out there to the left, you see an IP holding company. So you may employ different strategies with your operating entities that could share intellectual property. In your typical roll-up model, you may be buying companies that have their own brand awareness in their markets. But what if you want to start to consolidate them under the same brand, to build sort of a national brand for landscaping companies, right? What you may elect to do then is drop all of the IP related to that branding in a separate holding company, and then you will have a license agreement with each of your operating entities to use that intellectual property, and a royalty payment from each of your operating companies going back to that IP holding company. Why would you want to segment out your IP from your operating entities? Has anyone done this? Anyone have some thoughts on why you would want to move the IP into its own entity and lease it or license it to the operating entities? That's one great reason. Segregate its value, whether for exit purposes or not. Working with a client recently where we were doing a similar structure because they're rolling up entities, but want to be able to exit certain entities in certain segments without giving up rights to the IP. They have everything dropped into a separate IP holding company. They can terminate that license when they sell a portfolio company if they want to. They don't have to worry about carving out IP. Liability reasons. How important is your branding to you? If you're building a really strong national brand and you have some sort of legal liability in one of your operating companies that puts the assets of that company on the line, well, now your IP can't be touched, right? It's segregated into its own entity. So lots of reasons you may want to do this. And then there's some tax optimization with the royalty payments that you could even get into, how you expense the royalty payments within your structure. Real estate holding company, maybe the same analysis. From a liability perspective, if you're owning real estate through your structure, you may want to own that real estate in its own entity and lease the real estate to the operating companies, right? Now you have a product liability lawsuit in OpCo 1 in Utah. What can't they get at in a judgment? Your real estate, right? It's limited to what other assets may be in that operating company, which may be some working capital, maybe some cash, but they can't get at your $2 million facility, manufacturing facility. So real estate's a very common one to have in a separate holding company. Once again, similar to the IP, you'll then lease the real estate to the individual entities and have a lease payment back. Another popular reason for real estate, what if this was a segment structure rather than a geographic structure? This will make sense in a second. You have a segment structure where you have a manufacturing company that manufactures one widget. You have a different company that manufactures a different type of widget, and they share the same property. Now what do? If they share the same property, but you want to have these business lines segmented into different businesses, this poses a problem. Move the real estate out into its own company and lease the real estate to both entities solves your problem, right? So that's a very common strategy with real estate. Exact same analysis on equipment. You can do the same thing if you're an equipment-heavy business. So think back to your typical manufacturing, right? Move a lot of your heavy equipment, your expensive equipment out into a separate equipment holding company and lease that equipment to the individual entities that are actually going to be using it. What does that do? Once again, your liability protection. You've got a products liability suit. What are they not going to do? Take your building and all your equipment inside your building, right? That's limited to the assets of the operating company. There are, various permutations you can go with here. You can move pretty much anything into its own holding company, lease things around. You can move cash around, intercompany loans, dividending up and pushing it back down into different entities, assuming these are all fully controlled. And you see most of these are 100% controlled on my structure chart. What about operating company 3 out here to the right? This one's 72.5% owned by our operating holding company. Now we start to see a little more why you have your operating entities not owned directly into your holding company, but through an intermediate operating holding company. If you bring in outside investors, for example, in OpCo 3, how do you make sure that that equity is isolated to the business that you're fundraising for as opposed to your entire organization, right? If you sell shares in your HoldCo, your operating holding company, you're splitting equity across all 5 of your operating entities, and they have an ownership stake in all 5. That may be a strategy that you employ, right? There may be reasons not to invest on a project basis, but there could very well be reasons that you want to. And in this space, you see this a lot, right? Your first acquisition, second acquisition, third acquisition, you may need outside investors, but what if your strategy is to start building a large enough organization that you can eventually start cash flowing your future acquisitions, right? You want to be able to isolate your investors in those early projects where you needed outside equity, but 3 years down the road, your 5th acquisition may be 100% internal with bank debt and internal equity. So another strategic reason to isolate these operating companies down below. So I'll pause here for a second. Questions, Reg? It's a great question. To take a step back, one of the things you have to think about doing is moving the assets around your organization. And if you want assets owned by OpCo 3, say it has a bunch of equipment, and you now want to isolate that into an equipment holding company, you need to get that equipment from OpCo 3 over to your equipment company. What does that sound a lot like? That's an asset sale, right? I mean, it's literally an asset sale. It just happens to be a 100% controlled, internal asset sale. But the structure, the steps that it take are largely the same, right? You're going to have some sort of agreement to move the assets from one entity to the other. Your structure may impact how you do that, right? And this is where your tax planning comes in. So you may do that by distributing equipment, okay, out of an LLC, for example. Those of you familiar with your LLC agreements may know that there's a provision in there that says that you can distribute cash or make in-kind distributions of assets of the business. You can distribute up the assets up to your operating holding company, up to your holding company, and then contribute it back down to the equipment company. And there's your capital contribution from your HoldCo into your equipment company. So you're running a simultaneous analysis of the tax impacts, and depending on what your existing structure looks like, may impact how you do that. There may be a tax reason to literally treat it like an asset sale and have OpCo 3 enter into a purchase and sale agreement directly with the equipment company and maybe book an intercompany loan to pay off the equipment. There may be, depending on what your profit and loss situation looks like in OpCo 3, that may be advantageous. So there's a few different avenues, but largely the paperwork and steps will look similar to your typical asset deal. It happens to be an interested deal, so it'll probably be a lot smaller and a lot cleaner, right? When I would do internal reorganizations at my previous job, your typical contribution agreement is 2 pages. It's 1 paragraph of what you're actually doing, and a page and 3/4 of legal boilerplate that you have to do, even if it's an internal reorg. So the paperwork looks a lot easier, which means that if you spent $75,000 on your last roll-up acquisition, you're not going to spend $75,000 necessarily on implementing those steps. It'll be much quicker, much cleaner, but the actual step will look the same, whether it's if it's an asset sale or a distribution and contribution. Hand in hand with that, though, you're doing your tax planning, right? There's a second piece to this as you start to implement the structure. That will add some incremental costs. So while you're saving a lot on simple agreements and implementing simple transactions, you add a little bit back in your tax planning to understand the optimal way to do it. Yeah, it can be, and yes, the legal team or deal team should handle that. Depending on how you have your financing and your structure, who your bank is, you're right, you may have to rethink your debt structure as well. Because if you have a bunch of individual loans down at those operating companies, what's your bank not going to like for you to do, right? It doesn't want you to gut that entity and move all the assets out when it has a security interest in OpCo 3. You just got rid of all their security. So if you've already started to build a larger, complex organization where you've got debt at different levels, there is a different layer of complexity. You may end up negotiating with your bank on a new facility that refinances all that debt and puts it on your organization, where you move the debt higher up the structure and then have all these individual downstream entities guarantee the loan. But there are different. There's different options, but you're right. It's absolutely an issue that you would have to think through if you've got debt throughout your organization. It's a good question. Any others? Yeah, that's pretty easy to implement, assuming you get the tax planning right, and that's going to be impacted by what your existing structure looks like. But generally, just inserting an entity, particularly if it's a pass-through entity, like in this structure, from a tax perspective, nothing is actually happening because the ultimate beneficial ownership doesn't change at all. So it's literally just a matter of forming an entity and transferring the equity of OpCo 1, 2, and 3 to the operating HoldCo, and that's it, right? So your HoldCo up top in your example is directly owning 1, 2, and 3. Right, it's going to contribute. Right, when you form an LLC, how do you get equity interests? You pay for them in some way. Usually, with an equity investor, they put in cash. Right, they may buy 20% of your entity for $1 million. You can buy a piece of an entity with an in-kind contribution as well, and that's what you'd be doing there, rather than HoldCo paying operating HoldCo any money. It's contributing the equity interests of OpCo 1, 2, and 3, and in return getting 100% interest in your operating HoldCo, and your structure's done. You're talking, 10 pages of various legal documents for the 3 different entities. That's on the easier side of what to implement if you're just trying to slot in another pass-through entity. It's a great question. I know top of mind for everyone isn't necessarily what can I do, but how much does it cost? And that's a great question. I know that's what we're trying to drill into. $10. I saw another hand. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you're right. That's a complicated question. Transfer pricing injects a whole layer of regulatory and accounting complexity. There does have to be an appropriate royalty paid on what's known in accounting vernacular as the arm's length principle. What that means, I don't know. I think accountants largely make it up, but there's some, there's at least some literature out there of what that looks like. So yeah, it can't be royalty free if you're trying to take advantage of the transfer pricing rules. There has to be it has to look arm's length. So your accounting team will analyze how much IP is being done and being utilized and allocated to the various operating holding companies. What is an appropriate royalty, and then implement what that transfer pricing policy looks like. And it can get infinitely more complex from there. The larger the organizations go, the more variations you see in that. In a structure like this, it's going to be kept pretty simple. Your accounting team can sort of look at the market surveys and see, okay, an 8% royalty is typically what we have, and expense that out to the IP holdco, or to the operating company, I should say. No, this is strictly a straw man. Like I said at the start, this isn't necessarily what should you do. It's a what can you do, because there's so many different variations. A lot of this could be flipped. A lot of this could look like C corps if you're wanting to take advantage of the QSBS elections through your structure. So there's a lot more, and we'll turn to that here in a second. There's a lot that goes into the analysis of how you actually design the structure in terms of your tax status and your entity form. So this is intended to show what a structure would look like in terms of different entities, not necessarily entity type, because there's so much more that goes into that. It's hard to say, yeah, we recommend pass-through entities throughout your structure, because there could be a scenario where we don't recommend that, and it depends on the case-by-case basis. Let's move forward for a few minutes. So we've kind of been talking around a lot of the advantages of a holdco structure. I'll breeze through a few of these that we already hit. One of the biggest ones, and one of the reasons that I guess there's two main reasons that these structures get implemented. Tax we'll get to in a second. But one of the other main ones is liability protection. So, assuming your structure is set up right and assuming that it's managed right, you isolate liabilities and limit the liabilities into your individual entities, right? So one of the reasons you own things under that holding company is that if you have a liability in OpCo 1, you're not putting all of the assets from all of the other business lines on at risk, right? If you formed an entity and just started buying assets into that entity and multiple transactions, what's happening? You're growing the pie for potential liability, right? If you take the same entity, do a third transaction for $5 million, add $5 million more of value into that same business, and someone from your original acquisition brings a products liability claim, what can they get access to? All of those assets in your follow-on deals. If you've done those follow-on deals in individual entities, now you have your products liability claim in OpCo 1, and there's nothing that a plaintiff could do there to get to the assets of OpCo 2 or OpCo 3. Generally, we'll get to that caveat in a second. Centralized control we talked about with the shared services. So there's some one of the other big advantages is optimizing your cost structure. Rather than having 5 controllers, one in OpCo 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you may just need 2 controllers up in your shared services company that are running your portfolio. What does that do? You just lowered your head count by 3. So, by optimizing your management and centralizing control up into your holding company structure, you may be saving yourself a lot on the expense side. Your financing costs. So this gets back a little bit to what Reg was asking. If you're a bank and someone comes to you and wants to finance the acquisition of OpCo 3, what are you underwriting? What's the bank interested in? The assets of OpCo 3, right? Is that a bigger risk to the bank or a smaller risk than making a loan to HoldCo up top? What do you guys think? It's a much larger risk, right? What about up at HoldCo, you need a much larger loan though, right? Because now you've got 5 businesses, you need a much larger loan to finance those businesses. Does that offset the risk to the bank? Not necessarily, right? The bank is going to do a risk analysis and see, if something goes wrong in OpCo 3, what are the chances that something's also going wrong in OpCo 1, 2, 4, and 5? They don't necessarily correlate, right? So they actually protect themselves a lot more by moving up to the operating holding company and making a loan down to the broader organization, because if something goes wrong in OpCo 3, they've got cash flow from 1, 2, 4, and 5 to still service the debt. If they've lent directly into OpCo 3 and something goes wrong into OpCo 3, what's the problem? Well, now they're limited to OpCo 3's assets and the security there. Now, I don't want to get too far afield in financing structure, but there's something called structural subordination that you worry about when you're doing bank finance. And that is that the further you move upstream, the more subordinated the bank is in relation to the rest of your organization. That may sound counterintuitive, but here's why. If the loan is all the way up at the HoldCo, what has to happen in this structure in order for that debt to be serviced? The cash flow has to flow up. And so if the bank's not careful in structuring the debt, you could just say, you know what, I'm just going to stop distributing money out of HoldCo for now because we're experiencing some trouble and we're just going to stop paying our loan. And what can they do? So usually what happens is the further you go up the chain, you start having guarantees by the individual downstream entities. So in that scenario, you get the better credit profile of having your entire organization under one loan at HoldCo, but they're going to require all of those operating companies down below to guarantee the debt, usually with covenants that requires you to distribute out, based on an algorithm, a set formula, cash out of those entities to service the debt. So there is some opportunity to lower the financing risk, and the more you lower the financing risk and increase your credit rating, what does that do to your cost of debt? Your cost of debt starts to go down, right? So banks actually like these structures as you get more and more complex. They'll usually play ball in talking to you about a refinance upstream, assuming you've proven yourself as an operator. Just keep in mind, they're going to take a security interest and a lien on all the assets downstream to make sure that they don't get wiped out and have you come in and grant a loan in OpCo 3 and start siphoning off their money. So there is some opportunity to lower your financing costs with a better credit profile moving upstream. Finally, the big one, we only have a couple of minutes, but taxes, right? Again, what can you do, not necessarily what should you do. There's a lot you can do on the tax side with a HoldCo structure. Everyone, the topic du jour is the QSBS election that everyone likes to talk about. There are a lot of advantages and opportunities to the qualified small business stock structure. That doesn't mean it's risk-free, but it provides an interesting opportunity. Does anybody not know what the QSBS election is, just to level set? I think we're all kind of generally on the same page. So there's a provision of the tax code that says if a small business is a qualified small business, the QSB in QSBS, then the stock issued to a stockholders at original issuance, so new stock issued out of the entity, it can be qualified as qualified small business stock. And as long as you hold that stock for the required amount of time, and there's a whole bunch of other compliance things you have to go through, it depends on who the shareholder is, et cetera, you can deduct the greater, and I think a lot of people miss this point, the greater upon exit of $10 million or 10 times your basis in the stock. So there's not really a great scenario where this would happen, but what could happen, there's a limit to qualify for a qualified small business stock that the enterprise value, the gross asset value of the business before and after your investment can't exceed $50 million. So if in some way you found an opportunity to start a business, issue stock to yourself with a business worth $49.9 million, you could conceivably, when you exit that business, deduct up to $499 million not deduct, but it's not subject to capital gains taxes, right? It's the greater of $10 million or 10 times your basis. So this is what gets a lot of people interested in QSBS. They hear that and their mind is blown, right? I can acquire a company through a holding company that qualifies as a qualified small business for $5 million, and I could potentially deduct on exit down the road up to $50 million. Like that sounds pretty amazing. It comes with some downsides. It can only be a C Corp, for example. So during that holding period, what's the downside? The kind of classic downside to a C Corp, corporate tax, right? So you're paying corporate taxes during your holding period. So how long you hold may become an issue. What your exit plan is may become an issue. What if you're Chenmark and you're trying to build something, as a legacy potentially for your kids, and you don't plan to be exiting these businesses for decades? Maybe there's a different tax structure that doesn't depend on you exiting the business in order to optimize taxes. So there's some pluses and minuses, but that's a popular one. There's a lot of other tax elections you can make depending on your holding company structure. That just depends a lot on your goals, what's in your business, what's in your structure. Working hand in hand with your tax advisors to kind of arrive at what is most optimal, or at least most optimal for now. I always joke with people that when you structure based on tax optimization, you're one national election away from basically wiping out the tax advantages for your entire structure, right? Power changes hands in Washington. They revised the tax code, and the QSBS election was implemented in 2010 by President Obama. It's not that old, right? So 2024 election comes around. What if they decide to roll back the 2017 Tax Act or change portions of the 2017 Tax Act? And part of that is, well, let's revisit the QSBS. Now you've implemented a structure that 2 years from now, you've got to reanalyze, is this the right structure now? It just blew up my capital gains deduction, so what else should I be doing? So there's a lot at play here, and the final takeaway on that point is you just have to be prepared that your HoldCo structure, particularly from a tax optimization standpoint, is very likely to be kind of over your professional career, a living and dynamic structure, just by virtue of the way taxes work in America, right? Couple disadvantages just to wrap up here. So as you can imagine, implementing a structure like that, it adds a lot of, not necessarily a lot of expense to implement, but you've got ongoing compliance, right? Where you may have a few operating companies under one holding company. Now you've got an equipment leasing company and an IP holding company and all these different companies where you have to make sure that you're filing your annual franchise taxes into the various jurisdictions. You're required to qualify to do business in any jurisdiction where you're actively engaged in business. So if you move your real estate into a real estate holding company and lease that real estate to your operating entities in 6 different states, you now need to go qualify your real estate holding company in 6 different states, in addition to Delaware, in my example, where you formed it. So you can very quickly grow and increase the administrative and compliance burden of managing your org structure. And it's important to keep the costs and distraction in mind of keeping up compliance with that. And why is that important? You all may have heard the term piercing the corporate veil. If you aren't complying with the corporate formalities of your entity, in a lawsuit like we've been talking about, that products liability lawsuit down in OpCo 3, if you haven't been keeping up with the corporate formalities, and that plaintiff in the products liability lawsuit can quote unquote pierce the corporate veil, which means they pull back the limited liability protection of isolating everything in that entity. Now they're moving up your structure, and all of a sudden they're in that HoldCo making a claim for products liability, and now they can get to all 5 of those operating entities. So the cost of compliance isn't necessarily just this costs a little more time, a little more headache, and a little more money. If you're not doing it, it can actually turn into liability. One more thing on the disadvantages. It's not necessarily a disadvantage, but something to keep in mind, particularly on the liability side, is you may want to do an analysis with your insurance team. Can some of the liability concerns be taken care of with insurance policy rather than overly complicating your org structure? That may be part of your analysis in how you slice and dice your assets and move them around. The final advantage I'll mention and sign off for Kelsey is estate planning. So if you go back to my example, and I think a lot of us don't necessarily look at our business structures from this lens, but we're all personal people. We're not public companies operating on behalf of shareholders. We're private individuals building something, hopefully a legacy for ourselves, potentially our families, depending on what our goals are. We need to think about what the succession plan is. If I get hit by a car tomorrow, what happens with all my holdings and what do I do? Well, if I personally own 5 operating companies, I've got 5 operating companies I need to deal with. If I haven't done a proper estate plan, we're probating 5 different businesses, right? Drop it under a holding company, and whether sitting at the top of your holding company is a trust in an estate plan that avoids probate, or you have to actually subject your estate to probate, you're only probating one thing, the equity in HoldCo, and everything else follows. So there's a lot of estate planning advantages you can get out of a holding company structure. And I'll end on that just saying, this is a personal endeavor. It's not necessarily just slicing and dicing every dollar bill, but thinking about what we're building for the long term, who we're building it for, and a properly organized holding company structure can be just as effective from an estate planning, a succession planning, and a legacy building perspective as it can be from a tax optimization perspective. I'll end with that. We didn't leave a ton of time for questions, but feel free to come find me after at dinner tonight, whatever, ask away, and I'll do my best to answer without getting too deep into what you should do without knowing your business. But I'm happy to give it the old college try. So,
Kevin, thank you so much.